Hello everybody and welcome to GetLegal, our channel where we discuss topics that you may want to ask your own lawyer. We are not here to give legal advice, but if you need to talk to a lawyer, maybe some of our videos will help you put your questions into a legal perspective. Today, we are talking about privacy and the different aspects of building a privacy program for large organizations. In our last video, we asked questions about building a privacy team in an organization and considering the qualifications for such a team. Today, we begin by asking how we can generate awareness of our privacy program. I think it's important to make people, especially in your organization, to be aware about the importance of protecting data privacy. In other words, we want our fellow workers to be data security conscious. So, do we have a plan for spreading awareness? And even if you do, how frequently should we communicate this? After all, people can forget advertising campaigns, and a privacy campaign is no different. A communication plan will vary across different organizations in terms of how to communicate awareness of the privacy program. Do you send it by email? Do you post it on a bulletin board? Do you make them attend training? Do you display it in monitors around the company? Is it something on the company's internal website? How often do you communicate awareness? It seems we want to avoid sparse, infrequent campaigns where people may just forget about this important issue, vis-a-vis making it too frequent where people become desensitized and just ignore it. How much of the organization are aware of privacy issues before and after the campaign? Ideally, you are at the point where everyone is aware of the importance of data privacy, but what else should you measure to find out how well it is ingrained and that they are not just automatically repeating general statements about it? How can you measure this? Okay, so we know how we will communicate our privacy program. Next, let us ask how we will develop it. Since we built a team, let's ask who will develop the privacy program. I don't think this will be the work of one individual, but even if one person writes the documentation, it would take a village to get this finalized. Who will review it? Who will approve it, both informally and formally? Who will sponsor the document and bring it before an internal company body and get this approved? Do we need the approval of the board of directors, or just the chief executive officer? It should be approved by the Chief Privacy Officer, shouldn't it? What about HR? In writing the privacy program, you will be moving to lower levels of abstraction and into concrete action. We already covered awareness campaigns and how to do them. Will you develop a process flow, how this will be conducted? Who develops the awareness campaign, gets it approved, and then executes them? Which functions in the organizations will be consulted or approached for execution? Since the privacy program is, in part, driven by regulation, how do we monitor the regulations? What should we do if they change? Does the company have an internal privacy policy? How do we comply with it? How do we maintain an inventory of personal information that is being collected and processed? How do you classify personal information? How do you track the flow of processing the personal information? Asking these questions and documenting the answers will also bring forward the strengths and, more importantly, opportunities for strengthening the protection of privacy. It actually brings us to the next question. How do we assess the impact of processes to privacy? Because these questions are the first steps to a privacy impact assessment. Part of a good privacy program also plans responses for incidents. This is driven partly by regulations that require and impose minimum specific responses to an incident that compromises the confidentiality and privacy of personal information. The incident response plan should be documented and should clearly lay out the roles of responders in case there is a security incident or some breach of personal information. Regulations prescribing incident response may impose deadlines for taking action, and it is important for the plan to be aligned to these requirements. Next, is the privacy program being audited? It is good to have a privacy program, but it is also important to check if the program is working as prescribed or as written down. This is done through an audit procedure that reviews the activities and verifies if there is evidence that the privacy program is being followed. If there are gaps or failures identified, the privacy program should be corrected and failures in the system should be remedied. Come to think of it, this way of maintaining a program is good not just for privacy, but most other procedures in the organization. Now, after we talked about developing the privacy program, it is time to ask how it will be implemented. Our first order of business is raising awareness among stakeholders. They will be affected by the implementation, so it is important that they are informed about the program. If you recall, even at the development stage, different functions are informed about the program. More importantly, the development takes up how functions and processes will be modified by including privacy in departments and their processes. Ideally, their inclusion at the development stage would already give them an intimate awareness of the program and would already welcome its inclusion. However, there might be some parts of the organization who might need to be informed about this, so it is good to plan how to bring about awareness. In preparing the privacy program's framework, you need to regularly check that it follows applicable legislation and regulations. How frequently should you do this? In today's world, legislation and regulations develop and change faster than before, but the good news is receiving news and communication is also quicker. You need to keep this in mind so you can always make sure that your privacy program follows the law. How do you know if your program follows legal requirements? Whom should you consult? In general, legal can do a lot to help in this regard, and so it is a good idea to get legal involved. You see what I did there? But lawyers and the legal department do not work in a vacuum. Most privacy legislation are practical rules, and so when you get legal, the lawyer works with the people working in the department to match how actions in real life follow the legislation and regulation. In general, this process of legal consultation should be documented as part of the diligence being duly given to the program. Legal would probably be proactive and issue regular bulletins on legislative and regulatory changes. What aspects of the law should be tracked? In addition to identifying the specific activities or prohibitions under the law, it would be good to check the penalties for non-compliance. This also indicates the gravity of different activities and give proper priority to them. As an aside, it would be helpful to ask the following questions when monitoring the law. What actions are required by the law or regulation? When should the actions be done? If it is a prohibition, what actions can we take to make sure these are not committed? For example, do we need to build a process that can check or prevent the prohibited action or event from happening? What documents and other evidence should you keep that would prove you are following the law? Other important questions would be, who needs to do what? And how much will it cost? Always very important for the business. everything we discussed above is fine for your organization, but some organizations are so large that they do business in multiple geographic areas and jurisdictions. For such organizations, you will need to track multiple jurisdictions for changes in laws. And if you are operating internationally, do you process personal information across different countries and different affiliated entities? Then you have to think about having international data sharing agreements with the different entities where agreements are shared. Another important point to consider is the implication of doing business in countries without adequate privacy laws. If you have an organization that will send personal information to a country for processing, you should check if the country has laws that protect personal information. If not, then would it have a negative impact on the enforcement of privacy principles while your personal information is in that country? Very well. Since you developed your privacy program, we next want to know how well it is doing. In business, we manage what we can measure, so our next questions are about using metrics. Taking metrics in your privacy program means identifying what are important quantifiable elements that can be recorded for later analysis. The interesting part is identifying those elements. For this, part of what you will consider are the following questions. Who is the audience for the metrics? You will not be taking measurements for their own sake, so your first consideration is identifying who will read the reports. In most cases, this will be a higher level of management, but even then, it would be good to identify the role and managerial decisions of your audience. This will tell you what they need to know so they can appreciate the effectivity of your privacy program and in what ways it can be improved. Let's take an example of some common metrics. For example, would you consider the budget, cost, and spending an important measurement? Upper management might think so, although there are some contexts where maybe monetary budget would be a separate conversation, but you will need to keep an eye on this. How about the number of personal information being processed, the number of data subjects, the number of violations and rectification measures? How many security incidents have happened? How long did it take to respond to these incidents? It is interesting to count these items, but also it will depend on what marks an effective privacy program. There are actually many aspects that you can ask in terms of numbers and metrics. Next, once you identify the metrics, do you want to know where to find these numbers? What are your sources of these metrics so you can put them in your report? 3. Finally, as we mentioned above, how do you measure compliance? Next, in answering the question of metrics and compliance, we can ask how we measure the use of personal information. So, we can ask how many data subjects, that is about how many persons whose personal information we collect. But also, how many data points do we collect? How many are shared? And to how many processors? Then, how do you measure your compliance with your retention policy? For how long is the information retained? Is there any personal information being retained longer than necessary? Or if there are sufficient reasons for extending retention, do you have documentation to support and explain why these have been retained? In some cases, you might want to look at the process and system you develop for your retention policy to see if perhaps a change in the retention policy would redefine how long you keep your information. And if some personal information is retained for justifiable reasons, these would not be considered extensions or exceptions to the retention policy. After that, check that you have metrics for your disclosure to third parties. Very likely, you are making a disclosure under an agreement, and you can quantify how much information you disclose to third parties. On the other hand, If the personal information is received by a third party contrary to an agreement, or is accessed or received without proper authorization, you would be measuring your security incidents and data breaches. You could try quantifying or counting them according to how the incident or breach occurred. Was it human error? Violations of standard operating procedures? Social engineering? Number of personal information compromised? Given all the foregoing discussion, I think there can be so many ways to quantify and measure these aspects of the privacy program. But we must remember that the metrics you identify are those most useful to the person or persons who will receive your report. The interesting question is whether the metrics will determine how you manage the program. Will it determine your priorities? Or will your priorities determine your metrics? Here we have a follow-up set of questions. You recall earlier, we talked about raising privacy awareness and consciousness in the organization, so we will also measure how you conduct employee training. I'm not sure if you would have the time to do a baseline testing and then to do a post-test to see if people have learned from your training methods, but that is measurable. Another thing you can measure is how many of your employees have received training on privacy. Also, how frequently is this being done? I don't know if you will have the time to put these together, but maybe you can check if you can find a relationship between test results and frequency of training or awareness campaigns. After that, examine what are you measuring in your privacy impact assessments. Do you have a list or inventory of the different ways that you process personal information? How many of these have been subjected to a privacy impact assessment? How often should this be conducted? Are there any changes to the way you process personal information? How long before or after the change do you conduct the privacy impact assessment? How long does it take to conduct a privacy impact assessment? Do you have privacy risk indicators? If you do, how do you measure them? How proactive are you in addressing them? Are they ratings of low, medium, or high? Finally, for today, we will ask to what extent in your company functions do you have representation of governance mechanisms? Do you have any means of control to make sure that the different departments in your company have adequate procedures for protecting personal information and privacy? Well, we covered a few more questions today. Do you also have questions about privacy or having a privacy program in the workplace? Let us know and let us know what you think about these questions. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, like and subscribe and tap the bell icon. See you again next time.